Now that we've talked about frequency distributions and how to organize some data into a table, we'll now talk about something called histograms. Basically, what a histogram is a graphical display of a frequency distribution. So there's a couple of notions and things that we need to note about histograms, some properties of them, and then we'll actually do an example. The first thing to note is that histograms use contiguous vertical bars. This means that my vertical bars do need to touch. So it kind of looks like a bar graph, except for, like I said, those vertical bars do need to be touching each other. The next thing to note is that the y-axis could be frequency or relative frequency. This just depends on whether you want a frequency histogram or a relative frequency histogram. Either one of those is fine. So, now that we kind of have the setup of exactly what a histogram is, let's look at how to draw one. Our first step is to draw and label our axes. So we draw and label our axes, and we'll talk about a little bit about exactly what needs to go on each axis. We label the class boundaries on our x-axis, and this is the real reason we have class boundaries and why they're so important. They are going to be along our x-axis. Our y-axis is going to be labeled with frequency. This could also be relative frequency if you want to do a relative frequency histogram. Finally, make sure you use vertical bars to represent frequency. And like I said, these vertical bars should actually be touching. So now that we have some basic setup, let's do an example. Here we have a frequency distribution, and if you remember, this is the same frequency distribution that we did in a previous video, where we looked at the age of presidents at the time of their inauguration. So we did form this in the grouped frequency distribution video, and now we're going to build a histogram. So our first step was to draw and label our axes, and we wanted to put the boundaries on the x-axis. So we need to label the x-axis with this boundaries column. You'll notice it starts at 40.5, then we have 45.5, 50.5, 55.5, so it does increase in increments of 5. So let's start with that. We'll draw our axes, our x and y, and we know that it starts at 40.5, and like I said, we increase in terms of 5. So here is 45.5, 50.5, 55.5, 60.5, 65.5, and 70.5. So we have our x-axis labeled. Looking back at our frequency table, our frequency distribution, the y-axis gets labeled with frequency. And we see the highest is 16, so we need to make sure we go up to 16 on our y-axis. As we start labeling the y-axis, I'm going to label these in terms of 2. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, and 16, which was our highest frequency. Now that we have that, we just need to draw our bars. Looking at our table, we can see the first frequency is 2 and the second one is 8. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and draw our bars of height 2 and 8. Like we said, the first class is a height of 2 and the second one is 8. And we need to make sure our vertical bars do touch. So we've got our first 2 done. A little bit extra here that we can erase. Now let's look at our next 2 frequencies. Back at our table, we've already done the 2 and the 8. The next 2 will be 16 and 9. So let's plot those frequencies. Here's our graph. We need to go up to 16, making sure the bars touch. And then at 9. Now let's go back to our distribution. We've now plotted 16 and 9. Our final 2 frequencies are 7 and 3. Back at our table, we'll plot the next class at 7 and then the final one at 3. So now I have my histogram, which, like I said, just a graph showing what our frequency table showed us as well.